I've been hiding in this closet for 2 hours now. My phone is at 4% battery. The power is out. And something is moving through my house, something that shouldn't be here. I can hear it dragging itself across the floor outside my bedroom door. Scraping. Searching. It knows I'm still in the house. And I'm starting to think, it's always been here. Waiting for me to be alone. Welcome to the creepy shadow. If you love true scary stories that send shivers down your spine, you're in the right place. Tonight, I'm going to tell you about the 3 nights I spent alone in my childhood home. 3 nights that changed everything I thought I knew about reality, about what might be living alongside us, separated by the thinnest of barriers. I should warn you now, after hearing this, you might never feel comfortable alone in your house again. Especially at night, when the walls seem to lean inward, and that faint scratching sound you've always ignored suddenly takes on new meaning. Part 1. The Inheritance. My name is Morgan. 6 months ago, my grandmother passed away, leaving me her Victorian-style house in rural New Hampshire. It was the house where my mother grew up, where I spent summers as a child, and where, according to my grandmother's will, I needed to live for at least 6 months before I could decide whether to keep it or sell it. At first, I was reluctant. I had a good job in Boston, friends, a life I'd built for myself. But the timing was strangely perfect. My lease was ending and my company had just announced a remote work option. Plus, the idea of living rent-free in a beautiful old house while deciding what to do with it was tempting. So I packed up my apartment, put most of my furniture in storage, and moved to Blackwood Hollow. Grandma Ellis's house stood at the end of a winding gravel road, partially hidden by towering pines and surrounded by nearly 5 acres of woodland. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, an isolation that had seemed magical during summer visits but took on a different quality when I arrived on a gray October afternoon, knowing I'd be living there alone. The house itself was a classic Victorian, built in 1887 according to the deed, 3 stories with a widow's walk, decorative gingerbread trim along the eaves and a wraparound porch. It was well maintained but showed its age in subtle ways: creaking floorboards, doors that never quite closed properly, windows that rattled in strong winds. My first few weeks there were uneventful, even pleasant. I set up my home office in what had been my mother's childhood bedroom, explored the surrounding woods, and began the process of sorting through my grandmother's belongings. She hadn't been a hoarder by any means, but she had lived in the house for over 50 years, and every closet and drawer contained memories. It was during this sorting process that I found the first strange item: a small leather-bound journal wedged behind a drawer in her bedside table. The journal belonged to my great-grandfather, William Ellis, who had purchased the house in 1937. Most of the entries were mundane accounts of daily life, but scattered throughout were odd references to disturbances and unwanted visitors. Initially, I assumed he meant actual people, perhaps trespassers on the property. Then I found the entry dated November 17, 1938. Last night, the scratching in the walls returned. More insistent this time. Margaret insists it must be mice, but I know better. Mice don't move in patterns. Mice don't follow the sound of your voice from room to room, always staying hidden within the walls. And mice certainly don't whisper. I've sealed the basement door with the symbols Elder Hawkins provided. They seem to help during daylight hours, but once darkness falls, the barrier weakens. I'm considering more permanent measures, but Margaret refuses to discuss it further. She says acknowledging them only makes them stronger. Perhaps she's right. I remember laughing nervously after reading this entry. Great-grandpa William had obviously been a superstitious man with an overactive imagination, or perhaps the house had had a genuine pest problem that he'd interpreted through a lens of rural folklore. Either way, I closed the journal and returned to my sorting. That night, a powerful autumn storm rolled in. The rain lashed against the windows, wind howled through the eaves, and tree branches scraped against the roof like skeletal fingers. I've always found stormy weather comforting rather than frightening, the perfect backdrop for curling up with a good book and hot tea. By midnight, the storm had intensified. I was in bed reading when the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. Not entirely unexpected in a rural area during a major storm. I used my phone's flashlight to find candles and matches in the kitchen, then set them up around the house, on the bathroom counter, bedside table, living room mantel. The flickering light transformed the familiar rooms, casting long shadows and illuminating corners that usually remained in darkness. That's when I noticed something odd about the wallpaper in the hallway outside my bedroom. In the dancing candlelight, a pattern emerged that I'd never seen before. Subtle lines forming what looked like symbols or letters in a language I didn't recognize. They seemed to be underneath the floral patterned wallpaper, as if someone had written on the wall before it was papered over. Curious, I moved closer, running my fingers over the wall. The surface felt strangely warm, almost feverish, and as I traced one of the symbols, I could have sworn I felt it pulse beneath my fingertip. I jerked my hand back, heart suddenly racing. A trick of the mind, I told myself. Old houses settled and creaked. Candlelight played tricks on the eyes. I was letting Great-Grandpa William's journal entries influence my imagination. I was about to return to my bedroom when I heard it, a soft scratching sound coming from inside the wall, at approximately the spot where I'd touched the hidden symbol. I froze, listening intently. The scratching continued, light and rhythmic, like fingernails gently dragging across the inner surface of the wall. Just mice, I whispered to myself, echoing my great-grandmother's rational explanation from 80 years earlier. But then the scratching stopped, and in the silence that followed, I heard something that sent ice through my veins, a whisper so faint I couldn't make out words but unmistakably a voice, coming from inside the wall. I retreated to my bedroom, closing the door firmly behind me. The rational part of my brain offered explanations. Old pipes carrying sound from other parts of the house, the wind creating acoustic anomalies, my own tired mind misinterpreting natural creaks and groans of a house buffeted by storm winds. Yet as I lay in bed, candle flickering on the nightstand beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the house, or perhaps had always been there, but was now aware of me in a way it hadn't been before. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because I woke with a start at 3:17 a.m. according to my phone. The candle had burned out and the house was completely dark and silent. The storm had passed, leaving behind an unnatural stillness. What had woken me? I lay perfectly still, straining my ears. There it was again, scratching. Not from the hallway this time, but from somewhere beneath me. The floor below my bed. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling after the storm. But the scratching continued, becoming more deliberate. Then it stopped and I heard a soft thump. Then another. And another. Like something moving under the floorboards, making its way toward the edge of the bed. I switched on my phone's flashlight and directed it at the floor. Nothing unusual was visible on the old hardwood. The thumping had stopped the moment the light hit the floor, but as I watched, dust motes in the beam of light began to swirl unnaturally, gathering in a circular pattern directly beneath where the sound had been. I didn't sleep again that night. I kept the light on, watching the floor until dawn gradually brightened the room. When I finally got up the courage to examine the area under my bed in daylight, I found nothing unusual, no holes in the floor, no signs of pests, nothing to explain the sounds I'd heard. But on the underside of my mattress, visible only when I lifted it completely off the bed frame, was a strange mark, like a handprint but wrong somehow. The fingers were too long and thin, the thumb positioned at an impossible angle. It looked as if it had been burned into the fabric. I told myself it must have been there before, that I simply hadn't noticed it when setting up the bed. But deep down I knew it was new. And I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that something had reached up through the floor, through the bed frame, and touched my mattress while I slept above it. Power was restored that afternoon. I spent the day researching the history of the house, searching for any stories or legends that might explain what I'd experienced. The County Historical Society had limited information, just that the land had been part of a larger farm before my great-grandfather purchased it and that the original farmhouse had burned down in 1886. The Victorian that now stood there had been built on the original foundation the following year. There was no mention of strange occurrences, no local legends attached to the property. By evening, I'd almost convinced myself that stress, isolation, and an overactive imagination had combined to create a night of unfounded fears. Then the sun set and everything changed. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard a door slam upstairs. I froze, knife in hand, listening. I was absolutely alone in the house, all exterior doors locked. Yet the sound had been unmistakable, the distinctive slam of the bathroom door on the second floor. Setting down the knife, I moved cautiously to the bottom of the stairs, looking up toward the second-floor landing. "Hello," I called, immediately regretting it. If there was an intruder, I just announced my presence. No response came, but as I stood there, I noticed a dark liquid slowly spreading across the landing floor above, dripping down to the step below, then the next. I backed away as the droplets reached the bottom step, close enough now that I could identify the substance: water. Dirty water, like it might come from an overflowing, mud-clogged drain. Heart pounding, I climbed the stairs, following the trail of water to the bathroom door, which was now closed. With a trembling hand, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The bathroom was empty, bone dry. No sign of water anywhere, Not in the sink, not in the bathtub, not on the floor. I checked the other rooms on the second floor. Empty. The third floor, also empty. Every window closed, every door locked from the inside. I was completely alone in the house. Yet something had slammed that door and something had left that trail of water that had now vanished without a trace. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in my bedroom. Instead, I camped out on the living room sofa, lights blazing in every corner of the room, my laptop open beside me streaming a mindless sitcom for background noise. I didn't expect to sleep, but exhaustion eventually won out. I woke to darkness. The lights I'd left on were out, my laptop screen black. Power outage? No, the digital clock on the cable box still glowed, reading 3:17 a.m. The exact time I'd awakened the previous night. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized something was different about the room. The furniture had been rearranged. The armchair that normally sat across from the sofa now stood directly in front of me, barely 3 feet away facing the sofa. As if someone had moved it to sit and watch me sleep. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The sudden brightness confirmed what I'd seen. The chair had indeed been moved. And now I could see other changes. The coffee table pushed against the far wall, picture frames turned to face the wall, and most disturbingly, a trail of those same damp footprints leading from the hallway to the chair, then back again. Not human footprints. They were too narrow, the toes too long and spread wide apart, like elongated fingers. And they only went in one direction, despite showing both an approach and retreat. I followed the trail with my light heart hammering in my chest. The footprints led to the basement door, a door I distinctly remembered locking before settling in for the night. It now stood ajar, darkness spilling out from beyond like black ink. From deep within that darkness came a sound, the soft tap-tap-tap of something ascending the wooden steps. I ran. Out the front door, across the porch, into the yard, the wet grass cold against my bare feet. I didn't stop until I reached my car, fumbling with shaking hands to unlock it. Once inside, I locked the doors and sat trembling, staring at the dark silhouette of the house against the night sky. Nothing followed me out. No lights came on inside. The house simply stood there, patient and silent, its windows like watchful eyes. I spent the remainder of the night in my car, waiting for dawn. As first light broke over the trees, I gathered my courage and returned to the house, telling myself there would be a rational explanation for everything. Sleepwalking, perhaps, or vivid dreams merged with reality in my exhausted state. The living room appeared normal in the morning light, furniture back in its proper place. No damp footprints marked the hardwood floor. The basement door was closed and locked, just as I'd left it before falling asleep. If not for the mud on my feet from running through the yard, I might have convinced myself it had all been a dream. I couldn't stay another night, not yet. I packed a small bag and drove to the nearest motel, where I spent 2 dreamless nights recovering from what I'd experienced. Distance and daylight helped restore my rational mind, and I began to form theories. Old houses had all sorts of issues that could explain strange sounds. Power fluctuations could reset electronics and kill lights. And stress, isolation, and reading about my great-grandfather's superstitions had clearly affected my perception. By the 3rd day, I felt foolish for running away from my own inheritance. I returned to the house determined to face my fears and find logical explanations. The house welcomed me back with sun-dappled rooms and creaking floors that now seemed merely quaint rather than ominous. I spent the day cleaning, opening windows to let fresh air circulate, and finally doing what I should have done immediately, calling a local handyman to inspect the house for structural issues, pest problems, and electrical quirks. Mike Hadley arrived that afternoon, a burly, bearded man in his 60s who'd been maintaining homes in the area for decades. He spent hours examining the foundation, the walls, the electrical system, the plumbing. His verdict was largely positive. The house was in excellent condition for its age, with no major structural concerns and no evidence of pest infestation. "Your grandmother took good care of this place?" he said as we stood in the kitchen afterward. "Regular maintenance, prompt repairs. You don't often see that with these old Victorians." I hesitated, then decided to ask. "What about unusual features? Hidden spaces maybe? I've heard some of these old houses have secret rooms or passages." Mike gave me a curious look. "Planning to write a mystery novel?" I laughed nervously. "Just curious. The house makes some strange sounds at night." "All old houses talk," he said with a shrug. "But to answer your question, yes, this place does have some peculiarities. There's a space between the inner and outer walls that's wider than you typically find in construction from this period. Not quite large enough to be a passage, but big enough that you could theoretically hide things in there. And the basement. "What about the basement?" I prompted when he trailed off. Mike seemed to choose his words carefully. "The foundation is unusual. Most of it dates to the 1887 reconstruction, but parts of it are older, probably from the original farmhouse. And there's a section of the basement floor that's different from the rest. Might have been a root cellar originally, or maybe a well that was sealed over. Can you show me?" He led me down to the basement, a space I'd avoided since returning to the house. It was cleaner and better lit than most old house basements, with a concrete floor, stone foundation walls, and exposed wooden beams overhead. Mike pointed to a section in the northeast corner where the concrete appeared newer than the rest. "See how the color doesn't quite match? And it's perfectly square, about 6 feet by 6 feet. My guess is there was an opening there at some point, a trap door to a root cellar or a sealed well, and someone decided to concrete over it." I stared at the square of newer concrete, remembering the trail of inhuman footprints that had led to the basement door 2 nights earlier. Had something come from beneath that sealed space? Would it be possible to open it up? "See what's underneath?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Mike frowned. "Could be done, but I wouldn't recommend it. Old farm properties like this, you never know what you might find. Could be nothing, could be an old well shaft that's not safe to expose. And breaking up concrete is messy, expensive work." I nodded, not wanting to seem too interested. "Just curious." "You're probably right, best to leave it alone." After Mike left, I found myself drawn back to the basement, staring at that square of newer concrete. I knelt beside it, placing my palm flat against the surface. Like the wallpaper upstairs, it felt unusually warm to the touch, as if whatever lay beneath was generating heat. I had a sudden, overwhelming urge to find a sledgehammer and break through the concrete right then, to see what had been sealed away down there. The compulsion was so strong it frightened me, making me wonder if the thought was entirely my own. I backed away from the sealed area and hurried upstairs, closing and locking the basement door behind me. For the rest of the day, I kept busy with work calls and emails, deliberately avoiding thoughts of what might lie beneath the house. As night approached, I prepared for sleep with a new strategy in mind. I'd stay in my bedroom but leave lights on throughout the house. I set up a small security camera I'd purchased at a big box store on my way back from the motel. Nothing fancy, just a motion-activated camera that would alert my phone if it detected movement. I placed it in the hallway outside my room, angled to view both the stairs and the bathroom door. I also took another precaution, inspired by my great-grandfather's journal. At each doorway, I sprinkled a thin line of salt, an old folk remedy for keeping out unwanted spirits that seemed appropriately connected to whatever William Ellis had experienced in this same house. By midnight, I was in bed with my laptop, catching up on work while part of my attention remained fixed on the security camera app open in another window. The house was quiet except for the familiar creaks and settling sounds that no longer seemed quite so innocent. At 1:24 a.m., the first strange sound reached me, a soft tapping from somewhere downstairs. Tap tap tap. Pause. Tap tap tap. Like someone gently knocking, asking for permission to enter. I checked the security camera feed, nothing in the hallway. I switched to the audio settings and increased the volume, but the camera picked up only the normal ambient sounds of the house. The tapping continued, growing slightly louder. Tap tap tap. It seemed to be moving, circling the first floor as if testing each potential entrance. Then it stopped and a new sound replaced it, scratching from inside the walls. Not the light scratching I'd heard before, but deeper, more forceful, as if something was trying to claw its way through. It moved with purpose, starting at the far end of the house and working its way toward the stairs, then up, floor by floor, until it reached the wall adjacent to my bedroom. I sat frozen, unable to look away from that wall, which now appeared to bulge slightly in places, the wallpaper stretching and distorting. My security camera app chimed, motion detected, and I glanced down to see the feed showing an empty hallway, yet the motion detection was continuously triggering, the red recording indicator flashing rhythmically. On the wall beside my door, the floral wallpaper began to darken in spots, as if water was seeping through from behind. The spots expanded, connecting to form those same strange symbols I'd glimpsed during the power outage. Only now they weren't subtle. They stood out in stark black against the pale background, glistening wetly in the lamplight. My phone chimed again, not the security app this time but a text message. From my own number. "We're in the walls, we've always been in the walls, let us in Morgan, let us in like William did." The bedroom door swung slowly open, despite the salt line I'd placed across the threshold. The security camera app showed the door opening on its own, pushed by an invisible force. Beyond the doorway, the hallway appeared distorted, stretched longer than it should be, the far end receding into impossible darkness. Standing in that darkness was a figure, or the suggestion of a figure. A darker shadow within the shadows, its proportions wrong in ways I couldn't quite define. It didn't move toward me, but I could feel its attention, its hunger. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible even to my own ears. The shadow didn't respond, but the scratching in the walls intensified, surrounding me now on all sides. The symbols on the wall pulsed in rhythm with the sounds, dripping black liquid that pooled on the floor. From downstairs came a new sound, the basement door slowly opening, its hinges groaning in protest despite the lock I'd engaged. Heavy footsteps began ascending the stairs. Not the light tap-tap-tap from before, but deliberate, weighty steps that made the whole house tremble. The shadow in the hallway retreated, as if making way for whatever was coming up the stairs. The scratching in the walls stopped abruptly, replaced by whispers. Dozens of overlapping whispers too faint to distinguish words, but conveying a clear sense of anticipation. I was trapped. Whatever waited in the hallway blocked my only exit, and the footsteps were drawing closer, reaching the second-floor landing now. My phone's screen flickered and died, the security camera feed cutting out. At the same moment, all the lights in the house went dark. Total darkness engulfed me, a darkness so complete it felt physical, pressing against my skin. I couldn't see the walls, the door, my own hands in front of my face. But I could hear the footsteps continuing their slow, inexorable approach down the hallway toward my room. And beneath that sound, a new noise emerged, a wet, sliding sound like something heavy being dragged across the floor. It stopped just outside my doorway. In the perfect darkness, I sensed rather than saw a massive presence filling the frame, larger than any human could be, its bulk blocking what little ambient light might have come from the windows in the hallway. A smell reached me, damp earth, stagnant water, and something else, something ancient and wrong that made my body instinctively recoil. The darkness seemed to deepen, coalescing around the doorway as if the presence there was absorbing what little light remained. "William." The voice was barely a whisper, but it filled the room, reverberating inside my skull rather than through the air. "You've come back to us, William." It wasn't speaking to me, or rather, it was speaking to me but addressing someone it thought I was. My great-grandfather. Before I could process this, the presence moved. Not into the room but into the walls beside the door. The wallpaper bulged outward as something massive squeezed itself into the space between walls, something far too large to logically fit there. The bulge traveled along the wall, circling the room, surrounding me. I scrambled to the center of the bed, pulling my knees to my chest, watching in horror as every wall in the bedroom distended inward, the wooden studs creaking in protest. From within the walls, the whispering grew louder, more insistent, multiple voices now clearly distinguishable. "William, you promised. Sealed away for too long. The old arrangement. Need to feed." The temperature in the room plummeted until I could see my breath clouding before me. The darkness thinned just enough that I could make out shapes, the walls now pulsing like living things, the ceiling sagging downward as if under immense weight. And everywhere, those strange symbols glowed with a faint, sickly light of their own, no longer confined to the wallpaper but appearing on the ceiling, the floor, even across my bedsheets. They seemed to be moving, rearranging themselves, forming new patterns that made my vision blur when I tried to focus on them. "I'm not William," I managed to say, my voice shaking. "My name is Morgan. William Ellis was my great-grandfather." The pulsing of the walls paused. The whispers quieted momentarily as if conferring among themselves. "Ellis blood," came the eventual response, seeming to emanate from all directions at once. "Ellis house. Ellis agreement." "What agreement?" I asked, clinging to the conversation as a lifeline against paralyzing terror. "What did William promise you?" The answer came not in words but in visions that flashed before me, superimposed over the darkened room. I saw my great-grandfather standing in the basement, carving those same strange symbols into the foundation stones by candlelight. I saw him slicing his palm, pressing his bleeding hand against the central symbol. I saw what happened next, the concrete floor splitting open, a darkness boiling up from below, taking shapes that defied comprehension. William speaking to them, offering something, negotiating. The vision shifted. Decades passing in moments. The things in the walls remaining dormant but watchful, occasionally reaching into the house when certain conditions were met, taking what they needed but never too much, honoring some pact made with William. Until my grandmother's death. Until the house stood empty for months before my arrival. Until the agreement, whatever it was, went unfulfilled for too long. The visions faded, leaving me once again in the distorted bedroom with its pulsing walls and whispering voices. "Hungry now," the voices said in unison. "Ellis blood, promised, sustenance." The walls began to crack, splits appearing in the plaster and wallpaper. Through these cracks, I glimpsed movement, sinuous shapes sliding against each other, dark flesh with the texture of wet stone. Long, thin appendages with too many joints unfurled from the widening cracks, reaching toward the center of the room. Toward me. I screamed then, a primal sound torn from the deepest part of me. I scrambled off the bed, looking frantically for an escape. The doorway was blocked by a mass of writhing shadows. The windows were too far, beyond the reaching limbs that now emerged from every wall. In desperation, I dove beneath the bed, pressing myself against the floor. Above me, I heard the bed frame groan as something heavy moved onto it. The mattress sagged downward, nearly touching my back. Dust coated the floor beneath the bed, and in that dust I could make out a faint pattern. One of the symbols I'd seen on the walls, this one carved directly into the floorboards. Acting on instinct I didn't understand, I pressed my hand against the symbol. A sharp pain lanced through my palm and I felt warm wetness. My hand had been cut on something beneath the dust, perhaps a nail or splinter. Blood smeared across the carved symbol, filling its grooves. The effect was immediate. The symbol blazed with sudden light, and a shock wave seemed to emanate from it, rippling outward through the house. The pressure in the room released abruptly. The presence on the bed retreated, the appendages withdrawing into the walls with startling speed. The cracks sealed themselves, wallpaper and plaster knitting back together as if they'd never been damaged. Silence fell, broken only by my ragged breathing. After several minutes with no further sounds or movement, I cautiously emerged from beneath the bed. The room appeared normal, no distorted walls, no glowing symbols, no reaching limbs. Even the temperature had returned to normal. On the floor where my blood had touched the hidden symbol, there was no trace of either the carving or the blood itself, just smooth, polished floorboards. Dawn was breaking, gray light filtering through the curtains. I'd survived the night, though I didn't understand how or why. The house felt different now, not empty but settled, as if some balance had been restored. I checked my injured palm, expecting to find a cut or puncture wound, but there was nothing. No mark, no pain, not even dried blood. Yet I knew with absolute certainty that my blood had flowed, that it had fed something ancient and hungry that lived in the spaces between walls. As the morning light strengthened, I made a decision. I wouldn't flee again, not yet. There were answers in this house, in my great-grandfather's journal, in the history I had yet to uncover. Whatever agreement William Ellis had made with the things in the walls, I was now part of it, whether I wanted to be or not. And as terrifying as the night had been, one thought was even more frightening. What would happen if I left, if the agreement was broken completely? Would the things in the walls remain confined to this house, or would they find another way out, seeking the Ellis blood they seemed to crave? I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I could decide whether to run or to stay. And so began my research into what really lived in my grandmother's house. A journey that would lead me to discover family secrets far darker than I could have imagined, and to the second night alone that nearly cost me my life. Part 2. The Library. After my second encounter with whatever lived in the walls of my grandmother's house, I spent the daylight hours fortifying myself with research. I returned to my great-grandfather's journal, reading it cover to cover, searching for more information about the agreement the voices had mentioned. Most entries were frustratingly vague, referring to arrangements and necessary precautions without explicit details. But scattered throughout were references to a binding ritual that needed to be performed monthly to maintain the barriers, and occasional mentions of a book William consulted for guidance, something he called the Holloway Manuscript. This led me to explore the house more thoroughly, searching for this manuscript or any other documentation that might explain what William had been dealing with. My grandmother's home office yielded nothing unusual, nor did the attic storage spaces. It was in the library, a small room off the main parlor lined with built-in bookshelves, that I found my first real clue. Behind a row of leather-bound classics was a hidden panel in the wall, revealed only when I accidentally pressed a decorative carving while searching the shelves. The compartment contained a single item, an old brass key with an unusual design, its teeth forming one of the strange symbols I'd seen glowing on the walls during my nocturnal encounter. I recognized it immediately as a safety deposit box key. My grandmother had maintained an account at First Mercantile Bank in town, the same bank where she'd worked as a young woman before I was born. I'd already visited the bank to handle paperwork related to her estate but hadn't thought to ask about a safety deposit box. The bank was closed by the time I made this discovery, so I would have to wait until morning to investigate further. That meant spending another night in the house, something I approached with a mixture of dread and strange determination. This time I prepared differently. Instead of trying to keep the entities out, I decided to follow what appeared to be my great-grandfather's example, acknowledging their presence while establishing boundaries. In the basement, I found a loose stone in the foundation wall near the sealed concrete area Mike had pointed out. Behind it was a small tin box containing items that could only have been placed there by William. A small silver knife with a bone handle, a vial of what looked like salt but had a faintly reddish tint, and a folded paper with instructions written in faded ink. The ritual described was simple but unsettling. At sunset, I was to trace specific symbols at each threshold, doors, windows, the basement stairs, using the tinctured salt. Then, at midnight, I was to cut my palm and press my bleeding hand against the foundation stone where I'd found the box, while reciting a short phrase in a language I didn't recognize. Everything in my rational mind rebelled against this procedure. It smacked of superstition at best, dangerous cult practices at worst. Yet I couldn't deny what I'd experienced, couldn't explain away the voices, the distorted walls, the reaching limbs. And my blood on the symbol beneath my bed had undeniably stopped whatever was happening. As the sun began to set, I made my decision. I would perform the ritual as instructed, both as a protective measure and as an experiment. If nothing happened, I would have lost nothing but a small amount of blood and my dignity. Something did happen. Well, that would be an answer of a different kind. I began by tracing the salt mixture along each threshold, my hand steady despite my racing thoughts. The symbols formed easily under my fingers as if muscle memory was guiding me, though I'd never drawn them before. As I completed each one, I felt a subtle change in the atmosphere of the house. Not a relaxing of tension but a shifting like air pressure before a storm changes direction. At midnight, I descended to the basement, silver knife in hand. The sealed concrete section seemed to watch me as I knelt before the foundation stone where I'd found the box. Taking a deep breath, I sliced my palm, not deeply but enough to draw blood, and pressed it against the central symbol carved into the stone. The words on the paper flowed from my lips as if I'd spoken them 1,000 times before, though the language was utterly foreign to me. As the last syllable faded, my blood seemed to move of its own accord, filling the grooves of the carved symbol before sinking into the stone as if absorbed by a thirsty mouth. The temperature in the basement dropped sharply, my breath clouding before me. From within the walls came a sound like a collective exhalation, dozens of voices sighing in unison. The sealed concrete square in the floor vibrated slightly, small pebbles on its surface dancing with the tremor. 1 month, whispered a voice from everywhere and nowhere. The terms are met for 1 month. Then silence fell, as profound as if the house itself had been muted. The temperature gradually returned to normal, and the oppressive feeling that had permeated the house since my arrival lifted, replaced by a sensation I can only describe as watchful tolerance. I bandaged my hand and returned upstairs, where I slept deeply for the first time since moving in, undisturbed by scratching or whispers or distorted walls. Whatever the ritual had done, it seemed to have established a temporary truce. The next morning, I drove into town to First Mercantile Bank, the brass key secure in my pocket. The bank manager recognized me from my previous visit and was helpful but surprised when I inquired about a safety deposit box. "Your grandmother's box was quite large," she explained as she led me to the vault. "Annual fees were automatically deducted from her account. We assumed you knew about it." The box she unlocked with my key and her master key was indeed large, one of the biggest the bank offered. Inside was a single item, an aged leather satchel, its surface cracked with time but still intact. "I'll give you some privacy," the manager said, showing me to a small consultation room before withdrawing. Alone with my discovery, I carefully opened the satchel. It contained several items: a manuscript bound in what appeared to be very old leather, a sealed envelope with my name written in my grandmother's handwriting, a small wooden box, and a folded map of what I recognized as our property and the surrounding woods. I opened my grandmother's letter first. "My dear Morgan, if you're reading this, then I am gone and you have found the key I left for you. I had hoped to explain all of this to you in person when the time was right, but fate doesn't always allow for perfect timing. The manuscript you now possess is the Holloway Codex, entrusted to our family in 1937 when your great-grandfather purchased the house. It originally belonged to Edward Holloway, the man who built our home in 1887 after the previous structure burned. The knowledge contained within it is dangerous but necessary for anyone who lives in the house. What you must understand, dear one, is that our house was built upon something ancient, something that was there long before any structure stood on that land. The original settlers of Blackwood Hollow discovered it in 1742 and attempted to seal it away. Each subsequent owner of the property has become its caretaker, whether they wish to or not. Your great-grandfather made certain arrangements with the entities that dwell within the walls. Arrangements that I have maintained throughout my life, as did your grandfather before his passing. Now this responsibility falls to you. The wooden box contains tools you will need. The map shows locations on the property that are significant to the binding rituals that must be performed at specific times. The manuscript will explain everything else. I'm sorry to burden you with this inheritance. If you choose to sell the house and walk away, I would understand. But know that whoever owns the house next will be unprepared for what dwells within it, and the consequences could extend far beyond the property lines. All my love, Grandma Alice. My hands trembled as I set down the letter. My grandmother had known all along. She had been performing the same rituals, maintaining the same barriers, keeping whatever lived in the walls contained. And now that responsibility had passed to me. I turned to the manuscript, the Holloway Codex. The binding was unlike any book I'd seen before, the leather covering it discolored and textured in a way that seemed unnatural. I hesitated before touching it directly, then chided myself for being superstitious. The first pages contained a personal account by Edward Holloway, dated 1887. I write this record so that those who come after me will understand what lies beneath this land and how it must be contained. My predecessor failed in this duty, resulting in the fire that claimed his life and released what had been temporarily sealed away. I have made new arrangements, stronger bindings, but they require vigilance and sacrifice to maintain. The entities that dwell in the spaces between our world and others have existed since before human memory. The native peoples of this region knew of them and maintained barriers through their own rituals until European settlers drove them away. The settlers then took on this burden unwittingly, experiencing manifestations they interpreted through their religious beliefs as demonic activity. My research suggests these entities are neither demons nor spirits in the traditional sense, but something older, fragments of consciousness from a reality adjacent to our own, drawn to certain locations where the barrier between worlds is naturally thin. This property sits upon one such location, a junction point where multiple realities brush against each other. The house I have built incorporates specific architectural elements designed to contain these entities within the foundation and walls. The unusual width between inner and outer walls serves as a buffer zone, a space where they can exist without fully entering our reality. The symbols carved into the foundation stones bind them to these spaces, preventing manifestation under normal circumstances. However, these binding measures require regular renewal through ritual. The entities feed on psychic energy, emotional resonance, and most effectively, blood freely given by the property's rightful owner. A monthly offering prevents them from seeking these energies through other means. The rest of the manuscript detailed the binding rituals, far more extensive than the simple version I'd performed the previous night, along with observations about the entity's behavior, limitations, and attempts to communicate with them over the years. Most disturbing were the accounts of what happened when the rituals were neglected, manifestations growing stronger and more frequent, the entities becoming able to affect the physical world in increasingly dramatic ways, and eventually, attempts to claim living hosts to expand their influence beyond the house. The wooden box contained ritual implements, a more ornate version of the silver knife I'd found in the basement, vials of various powdered substances labeled in faded handwriting, a small stone bowl with those same symbols carved around its rim, and a pocket watch that, upon inspection, didn't tell time but instead tracked lunar phases. The map showed 7 locations on the property marked with different symbols, one at the house itself, the others scattered throughout the surrounding woods, forming a rough circle with the house at the center. According to the Codex, a complete binding ritual required visiting each location in a specific sequence during the dark of the moon, refreshing the symbols at each site with a mixture of salt, certain herbs, and the property owner's blood. The ritual I'd performed in the basement was merely a temporary measure, a stopgap that would satisfy the entities for a limited time. The next dark of the moon was in 3 weeks. Until then, my improvised ritual should hold, assuming the Codex and my grandmother's letter were accurate. I carefully repacked everything except the manuscript itself, which I needed to study further. The bank manager seemed unsurprised when I asked to continue renting the safety deposit box. Perhaps my grandmother had been a regular visitor over the years, retrieving the Codex when needed for reference. That night, I sat in the library with the manuscript open before me, absorbing its contents and contemplating my situation. The house around me felt different now, not exactly safe but stable, as if some understanding had been reached between its resident entities and myself. As I read deeper into the codex, I found accounts by other owners over the years, additions to Holloway's original text. Some were brief notes about ritual modifications they'd found effective. Others were longer narratives about specific encounters with the entities. My great-grandfather William had written several entries, as had his son, my grandfather, and even my grandmother had added her observations in a neat, precise hand. One entry by William caught my attention. Dated November 1943, it described an attempt to communicate more directly with the entities. I have been experimenting with a method of conscious engagement during the twilight state between waking and sleep. By focusing on the primary binding symbol while entering this state, I can sometimes perceive the entities more clearly without allowing them to fully manifest. Last night, I succeeded in establishing a dialogue of sorts. Their consciousness is collective yet fragmented. Many voices that form a single purpose. They exist in a reality where time moves differently, experiencing our linear progression as a simultaneous whole. Most significantly, I have confirmed what I long suspected. They cannot be permanently banished or destroyed by any means available to us. The binding rituals do not imprison them so much as establish boundaries they agree to honor. They permit us to occupy the surface world in exchange for the energies we provide, which they seem to require for their continued existence. They refer to themselves by a name I cannot transcribe precisely in our language, but which translates roughly as the Waiting Ones. They have been here far longer than human settlement, and they will remain long after we are gone. This revelation was both fascinating and troubling. The entities, the Waiting Ones, weren't simply supernatural pests to be exorcised or evil spirits to be banished. They were ancient consciousnesses with whom my family had established a symbiotic relationship of sorts. Territory and safety in exchange for the energy they needed. Further entries detailed various owners' experiences with the monthly offering ritual. Most reported a relatively peaceful coexistence once the pattern was established. Problems arose primarily when rituals were delayed or when outsiders spent too much time in the house, unaware of the arrangement and thus unprotected by it. By the time I closed the codex in the early hours of the morning, I had a much clearer understanding of what I was dealing with. The question now was whether I could accept this inheritance, not just the house itself but the responsibility that came with it. The alternative was to sell the property, potentially to someone who would dismiss my warnings as superstition or madness. The codex suggested that new owners would eventually discover the truth, but only after the Waiting Ones had grown hungry and aggressive enough to make their presence undeniable. By then it might be too late for a peaceful resolution. I spent the next 3 weeks in intensive preparation. During daylight hours, I explored the 7 locations marked on the map, finding at each one a small stone marker carved with symbols matching those in the codex. These markers were cleverly disguised as natural features. A weathered boulder, a distinctive tree stump, a rock formation beside a small stream, visible only when you knew exactly what to look for. At night, I studied the codex, memorizing the ritual procedures and practicing the unfamiliar words until they flowed naturally. The house remained quiet, the temporary binding holding as promised. Occasionally I would feel a subtle presence watching me, especially in the library as I read the manuscript, but no malevolent manifestations occurred. 2 days before the dark of the moon, I gathered all the necessary supplies. The ritual implements from the wooden box, fresh herbs from a local nursery that matched the codex's descriptions, additional salt and other materials. I prepared the mixture according to the instructions, steeping certain elements for the required 48 hours. On the appointed night, I waited until midnight before beginning the ritual. The procedure was complex, requiring me to visit each marker in a specific sequence, refreshing the symbols with the prepared mixture combined with drops of my blood, while reciting specific phrases at each location. The first marker was in the basement of the house itself, beneath the square of newer concrete that Mike had pointed out. After reviewing the codex one final time, I took a sledgehammer to that section of the floor, breaking through to reveal what lay beneath. A stone well shaft, sealed with a capstone carved with the now familiar binding symbol. I performed the first part of the ritual there, cutting my palm and allowing my blood to drip onto the symbol while speaking the words from the codex. As the last syllable left my lips, the symbol flared with a cold blue light, and a vibration ran through the house from foundation to roof. Then I moved on to the outdoor locations, walking the darkened woods with only a flashlight to guide me. At each marker, I repeated the process, refreshing the symbol with the mixture, adding my blood, speaking the words. Each time, the completed symbol would glow briefly before fading back to normal appearance. The final location was the furthest from the house, an outcropping of rock on the edge of the property that overlooked a small ravine. According to the map, this was where the original settlers had first discovered the junction point between realities, where the waiting ones had first made contact with the human world. As I completed the ritual at this final marker, something different happened. Instead of simply glowing and fading, the symbol pulsed with light in a rhythmic pattern like a heartbeat. The air around me thickened, making it difficult to breathe, and the temperature dropped so rapidly that frost formed on the surrounding vegetation. From the ravine below came a sound, not the scratching or whispering I'd heard in the house, but a deep, resonant hum that I felt in my bones more than heard with my ears. The ground beneath my feet trembled slightly, and for a moment, I could see my breath hanging in the air before me, forming shapes that resembled the binding symbols before dissolving. "We accept the renewed terms," said a voice from the darkness, the same collective whisper I'd heard in the basement but clearer now, more focused. "The balance is restored for one cycle of the moon." "And then?" I asked, surprising myself with my boldness. "Then it must be renewed again. As it has always been. As it must always be." "For how long?" I pressed, needing to understand the full scope of what I was committing to. "How long must this continue?" The humming intensified, the vibration traveling up my legs and into my chest, making my heart stutter in its rhythm. The air around me seemed to bend and distort, reality itself becoming malleable at the edges of my vision. "Until the stars align differently," came the reply, the multiple voices separating briefly so that I could distinguish different tones and timbres, some high and thin, others deep and resonant, all speaking in unison yet distinctly. "Until the junction shifts. Until we complete our waiting." "Waiting for what?" I whispered. But the presence was already receding, the humming fading, the air returning to its normal consistency. The symbol on the rock outcropping gave one final pulse of light before going dark, leaving me alone in the silent woods. I made my way back to the house, physically exhausted but mentally alert, turning over what I'd experienced. The ritual had worked, the binding was renewed, but I was left with more questions than answers. What were the waiting ones ultimately waiting for? How long had they been here and how much longer would they remain? Was I committing myself to a lifetime of monthly rituals, or was there another solution? The Codex had hinted at attempts by previous owners to find alternatives to the blood offering, some more successful than others. My great-grandfather's experiments with communication suggested there might be more to learn about these entities, perhaps even a way to coexist that required less intensive maintenance. For now, however, I had bought myself a month of peace. A month to decide whether to continue this inherited obligation or to find another path. I should have known that the waiting ones wouldn't make that decision simple. 3 nights after completing the full ritual, I was awakened from a deep sleep by a sudden cold that penetrated to my bones. My bedroom was dark but not empty. I could sense a presence beside my bed watching me. "We need to show you," whispered that now familiar collective voice. "Need you to understand." Before I could respond, the darkness around me shifted, deepened, and I felt myself falling, not physically but mentally, my consciousness being pulled away from my body and into someplace else. I experienced a disorienting series of visions: ancient forests covering the land where the house now stood, indigenous people performing rituals at the stone outcropping, European settlers discovering the same site and reacting with fear and religious fervor, the first house being built, then burning, Holloway constructing the current Victorian with its specialized architecture. Through it all ran a constant presence. The waiting ones, observing, interacting when permitted or when boundaries weakened, existing in those in-between spaces that weren't quite our reality but connected to it. The visions accelerated through time, showing me previous owners performing the same rituals I had recently completed, each adding their blood to the ancient pact. I saw my grandmother, younger than I'd ever known her, standing at the well in the basement, speaking words I now recognized. Then the perspective shifted, and I was seeing through different senses entirely, perceiving reality as the waiting ones did. Our solid world appeared permeable, transparent in places, with currents of energy flowing through what we thought of as solid matter. Human beings glowed with internal light, some brighter than others, their emotions and thoughts creating ripples in the fabric of reality. And beyond our world, I glimpsed what they were waiting for: a celestial alignment, stars moving through vast cycles, gradually creating a configuration that would thin the barriers between realities completely. Not soon but inevitably, like a cosmic clock ticking toward midnight. I came back to myself with a gasp, sitting upright in bed. The presence was gone, the room normal again, but the visions remained vivid in my mind. The waiting ones had shown me their perspective, their purpose, their patience extending over thousands of years toward an event that might still be centuries away. They weren't malevolent, exactly, but neither were they benign. They were simply other, existing according to principles and purposes so alien to human understanding that our categories of good and evil didn't apply. They needed what we provided, the energy of consciousness concentrated and freely given, and in exchange they remained contained, controlled. Until the stars aligned. Until their waiting ended. What would happen then they hadn't shown me. The next morning I found something new in the library, a blank journal placed on the desk, open to the first page. A pen lay across it, positioned perfectly straight. An invitation, I understood, to continue the record that Holloway had begun, that my family had maintained across generations. This was my inheritance, more binding than the house itself, knowledge and responsibility, passed down through blood and ritual. I had already taken the first steps along this path by performing the renewal rites. Now I needed to decide whether to fully accept what that meant. As I considered my options, I became aware of subtle changes in my perception. I could sense the in-between spaces now, could feel the presence of the waiting ones in the walls around me. Not threatening but aware, attentive. The house felt alive in a way I couldn't have comprehended before the visions. I picked up the pen and began to write my first entry in what would become my own contribution to the codex. Whatever I decided, this experience needed to be documented for those who might come after me. What I didn't realize then was that my decision would be forced by events beyond my control, and that my third night alone in the house would bring me face to face with an entirely different threat, one that neither the codex nor my family's records had prepared me for. Part 3, The Intruders. For 2 weeks following the renewal ritual, life settled into a strange new normal. The house remained quiet, the waiting ones honoring their part of the arrangement by staying within the walls. I established a routine of work during the day and research in the evenings, deepening my understanding of the codex and my family's history with the property. I began experimenting with some of the more advanced techniques described by my great-grandfather, particularly his methods of conscious communication with the waiting ones during the twilight state between waking and sleep. My first attempts yielded only fragmentary results. Disconnected images, whispered words I couldn't quite catch, sensations of presence without clear communication. But on the 17th night after the ritual, I achieved a breakthrough. As I drifted toward sleep while focusing on the primary binding symbol, which I'd drawn on a card placed on my nightstand, I felt that now familiar shift in consciousness, not quite dreaming, not quite awake, but somewhere in between. This time, however, instead of passive observation, I actively reached out with my thoughts, calling to the waiting ones. The response was immediate and startling, a rush of presence filling my awareness, not just one consciousness but many, overlapping, intertwining. "We have been expecting you, Bloodkeeper," they communicated, not in words exactly, but in concepts that my mind translated into language. Few have sought direct communion. Fewer still have understood what they perceived. I asked the questions that had been forming since my first encounter with them. What were they, truly? How long had they been here? What would happen when their waiting ended? The answers came in a flood of impressions too complex to fully comprehend. They existed simultaneously in multiple realities, anchored to certain junction points like the one beneath the house. They had been present since before humans evolved, perceiving time differently than we did. What seemed like patient waiting to us was simply existing to them. As for the event they awaited, they showed me again that celestial alignment, stars moving through vast cycles, but this time with greater detail. It wasn't an ending they anticipated, but a transformation. A realignment of realities that would allow them to shift to a different state of being, one less constrained by the boundaries between worlds. "We do not wish harm," they impressed upon me. "We could take by force what we need to sustain ourselves, but the taking would destroy the taken. The arrangement benefits both." When I asked why my blood specifically was required, why it couldn't be any blood freely given, their answer was both simple and unsettling. Blood binds. Ellis blood has renewed the binding for generations. The pattern is set. To change it now would weaken all that has been built. I came out of the twilight state with a deeper understanding, but also new concerns. The waiting ones weren't evil, but they were fundamentally inhuman, operating according to principles and necessities I could only partially grasp. The binding ritual didn't just feed them, it reinforced the architecture of containment that Holloway and my ancestors had constructed. If that architecture failed, if the bindings weakened too much, the waiting ones wouldn't be destroyed or banished. They would simply no longer be contained by the parameters of the arrangement. And while they claimed not to wish harm, their concept of harm might differ dramatically from human understanding. I recorded everything I'd learned in my new journal, adding my observations to the generations of notes that formed the expanded codex. As I wrote, I came to a decision. I would stay at least long enough to fully understand my inheritance and to ensure the binding remained strong. If I eventually chose to leave, I would need to find a way to transfer the obligation safely, perhaps to another Ellis relative, though I wasn't sure any would be willing to take on such a burden. This decision made, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced since moving to the house. I was no longer simply reacting to frightening phenomena, I was actively engaging with something ancient and mysterious, continuing a family tradition that stretched back generations. That sense of purpose carried me through the following days as I balanced my remote work with deeper study of the codex. I began mapping the in-between spaces more systematically, using the blueprints of the house to mark where the walls were widest, where the waiting ones seemed most active at different times of day. I also started exploring the property more extensively, visiting each of the 7 marker sites regularly to check the condition of the binding symbols. During these explorations, I discovered several features not marked on my grandmother's map. A small, spring-fed pond deep in the woods, the ruins of what might have been an earlier structure predating even the first farmhouse, and most intriguingly, a series of standing stones arranged in a pattern that matched the binding symbol, nearly hidden by undergrowth and the passage of time. It was during one of these explorations, 3 weeks after the renewal ritual, that I first realized something was wrong. I had hiked to the furthest marker, the rock outcropping overlooking the ravine, and found the binding symbol there partially obscured by mud and debris, as if someone had deliberately tried to erase it. This was troubling for 2 reasons. First, these locations were on private property far from any public trails or roads. Second, the markers were designed to blend into the natural landscape, virtually invisible unless you knew exactly what to look for. Someone would have needed both my grandmother's map and specific knowledge of the binding symbols to locate and target this particular stone. I cleaned the symbol and refreshed it using a small emergency kit I'd begun carrying with me. Nothing as potent as the full ritual materials, but enough to maintain the integrity of the binding until the next renewal. As I worked, I had the distinct impression of being watched, and not by the waiting ones whose presence I'd grown familiar with. This was different, mundane rather than otherworldly but no less concerning. On my way back to the house, I found footprints that weren't mine. Boot prints from someone with a larger foot, following the same faint trail I used to access the markers. In several places, I noticed broken branches and disturbed undergrowth, signs of someone moving through the woods without my knowledge of the terrain. By the time I reached the house, dusk was falling. I locked all the doors and windows, drawing curtains and checking each room meticulously. Nothing seemed disturbed inside, but my sense of security had been shattered. Someone had been on the property, someone who knew about the markers and had deliberately interfered with at least one binding symbol. I considered calling the police but quickly dismissed the idea. What would I tell them? That someone had smudged a strange symbol on a rock in the woods behind my house? That I was worried about intruders who might be interfering with supernatural binding rituals? At best, they would think I was overreacting to hikers who had strayed onto private property. At worst, they might question my mental stability. Instead, I retrieved my great-grandfather's revolver from the lockbox where I'd found it during my initial exploration of the house. I checked that it was loaded and functional, then placed it in the drawer of my bedside table. I wasn't particularly comfortable with firearms, but the isolation of the house made me grateful for any means of protection. That night, I lay awake listening to every sound the old house made, trying to distinguish between its normal creaks and groans and any noises that might indicate an intruder. Around 2 a.m., I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, only to be awakened an hour later by a sound that definitely didn't belong to the house's usual nocturnal symphony, the soft scrape of metal against metal, coming from the direction of the back door. I sat up, immediately alert, and reached for the revolver. The sound came again, followed by a faint click that I recognized as the back door lock being manipulated. Someone was trying to break in. Moving as quietly as possible, I slipped out of bed and positioned myself behind my bedroom door, which opened onto the second-floor hallway overlooking the main staircase. From there, I would be able to see anyone entering from the back of the house, which connected to the kitchen and then the main hall. I heard the back door open, hinges creaking slightly despite my recent oiling of them. Soft footsteps moved through the kitchen. Not just one person, I realized with growing alarm, but at least 2, maybe 3, moving with the deliberate quietness of those trying to remain undetected. "Spread out," a man's voice whispered, just loud enough for me to catch. "Check upstairs first." The cellar entrance is in the kitchen, we'll do that last. Ice ran through my veins. These weren't random burglars who had chosen the isolated house opportunistically. They knew the layout. They had specific targets in mind. And based on their mention of the cellar rather than basement, they were using older terminology, perhaps from the codex itself or other historical documents related to the house. I had a split second to decide whether to confront them directly or try to hide and call for help. The decision was made for me when I heard footsteps on the stairs, quick, confident steps of someone who knew where they were going. Backing into my bedroom, I closed the door most of the way, leaving just enough space to see through. I positioned myself behind it, revolver held ready but not yet raised. I wasn't willing to shoot someone without clear provocation, but I wanted the weapon visible as a deterrent when I confronted them. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. A beam of flashlight swept the hallway, briefly illuminating the doorway to my bedroom. I could make out a silhouette, male, tall, wearing what looked like dark clothing. Second door on the right should be the master bedroom. The man on the stairs called down softly to his companions. That's where she'll be sleeping. They thought I was my grandmother. They didn't know she had passed away, didn't know I was now the occupant. This confusion might work to my advantage. The man moved toward my door. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. As he pushed the door open and stepped into the room, I moved from behind it, positioning the revolver where it would be clearly visible. That's far enough, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. The intruder froze, his flashlight beam dropping to point at the floor rather than directly at me, a small courtesy that seemed oddly out of place in a home invasion. In the ambient light from the hallway, I could see him more clearly now, a man in his 40s or early 50s with a lean face and close-cropped gray hair. He wore dark clothes that weren't quite military but had that practical, tactical quality. "You're not Margaret Ellis?" he said, surprise evident in his voice. "No, I'm her granddaughter. Margaret passed away 6 months ago." He processed this information, his expression shifting from surprise to what looked like concern. "And you've been living here since then? In this house? Who are you?" I demanded, ignoring his question. "What are you doing in my home?" Before he could answer, heavier footsteps pounded up the stairs, and a second man appeared in the doorway, larger, broader, with a bushy beard and intense eyes that widened when he saw the revolver in my hand. "Easy now," the first man said, raising his hands slightly to show they were empty. "We're not here to hurt you. My name is Daniel Holloway. Edward Holloway was my great-grandfather." The name hit me like a physical blow. Holloway, the author of the Codex, the man who had built this house and established the binding rituals. If this man was telling the truth, his connection to the house and what lived within its walls was as deep as my own. "Prove it," I said, not lowering the revolver. Daniel reached slowly into his jacket pocket and withdrew a leather wallet. Opening it, he removed an old photograph and held it out to me. "Edward Holloway and William Ellis, 1938. Your great-grandfather and mine." I stepped forward cautiously and took the photo with my free hand, keeping the gun trained on Daniel. The photograph showed two men standing in front of the house. One I recognized from family photos as William Ellis, the other presumably Edward Holloway. They looked solemn but not unfriendly, like business partners rather than close friends. "Why break into the house?" I asked, still suspicious despite the photograph. "Why not knock on the door during the day like normal people?" "We needed to check the binding in the cellar," Daniel explained. "We've been monitoring the property for years, working with your grandmother to maintain the seals. When we lost contact with her months ago, we grew concerned, but we couldn't approach directly without knowing who was living here now." "And the marker in the woods? The one someone tried to obscure?" The second man shifted uncomfortably. Daniel gave him a sharp look before turning back to me. "A precautionary measure. We needed to assess whether the bindings were still being maintained. If they weren't, we had plans to intervene more directly." "By weakening one of the markers? How does that help maintain anything?" "It was a test," Daniel said. "If someone was performing the rituals properly, they would notice the damage and repair it promptly. If the marker remained damaged, we would know the binding was being neglected." It made a certain kind of sense, though I didn't appreciate being tested without my knowledge or consent. I lowered the revolver slightly but didn't put it down. "How many of you are there?" I asked. "Just 3. Myself, Robert," he nodded to the bearded man, "and Elaine, who's downstairs." As if on cue, a woman's voice called up from below. "Daniel? Everything okay up there?" "We're fine," Daniel called back. "We've met Margaret's granddaughter. She's been living in the house." Footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of the third intruder, a woman perhaps a few years older than me, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and sharp, assessing eyes that took in the scene quickly. "Has she been maintaining the binding?" Elaine asked Daniel directly, as if I weren't standing right there with a gun. "I have," I answered before Daniel could respond. "Full renewal at the dark of the moon 3 weeks ago. And yes, I've read the codex. I know what lives in the walls." All three of them looked at me with new expressions: surprise, relief, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Respect, perhaps, or concern. "Then you understand why we're here," Daniel said. "The binding requires regular maintenance from blood relations of both families, Alice and Holloway. Your grandmother and I performed the joint ritual every 3 months. The last one was due 6 weeks ago." This was new information not mentioned in the sections of the codex I'd read. Joint ritual? The manuscript only mentioned the monthly renewal by the property owner. Daniel nodded. "The monthly renewal maintains the basic containment, but the quarterly joint ritual strengthens the deeper bindings, the ones that keep the waiting ones from evolving beyond their current state. Without both bloodlines participating, the full containment system eventually begins to degrade." A chill ran through me as I recalled the vision the waiting ones had shared, their anticipated transformation when the stars aligned. Was that what the joint ritual prevented? Or merely delayed? "So you broke in to perform this ritual without me?" I asked, still not entirely trusting their explanation. "We came to assess the situation," Daniel corrected. "Ideally, yes, we would perform the joint ritual tonight. It's the dark of the moon again, the optimal time. But we needed to see how degraded the binding had become first. If the damage was too severe, we might have needed more extreme measures." I finally lowered the revolver completely, setting it on my nightstand but keeping it within reach. "Show me this joint ritual. If what you're saying is true, I want to understand exactly what we're dealing with." Daniel nodded, seeming relieved by my cooperative shift. "We should move to the cellar. The primary nexus point is there, beneath the sealed concrete." The four of us made our way downstairs, an awkward procession of former intruders and reluctant host. In the kitchen, Elaine retrieved a large canvas bag they'd brought with them, which I now realized must contain ritual materials. "How did you know my grandmother?" I asked as we descended the basement stairs, curiosity temporarily overriding my wariness. "Our families have been connected since 1938, when Edward sold the house to William," Daniel explained. "The transfer of the property required a transfer of responsibility, but Edward understood that completely severing the Holloway bloodline from the binding would destabilize the entire system. So the two families formed a pact. Alice would own and occupy the property, performing the monthly maintenance, while Holloway would return quarterly to reinforce the deeper bindings. We've kept detailed records," Elaine added, "passing down the knowledge and responsibility just as your family has. Daniel's father worked with your grandfather, and then Daniel took over working with your grandmother for the past 30 years. This explained much of what I'd found mysterious in the codex, references to the other keepers, and the quarterly strengthening without explicit details about who or what was involved. Apparently, those details had been kept separate, maintained by the Holloway line independently." In the basement, Robert began clearing away boxes and furniture from the area around the sealed concrete square, creating a workspace approximately 10 feet in diameter. Elaine unpacked their bag, revealing items similar to those I'd found in my wooden box, but with subtle differences. Her knife had a handle of darker wood with different symbols, and her stone bowl was larger, with more complex engravings. Daniel directed me to stand at the north edge of the concrete square while he took position at the south. Robert and Elaine moved to east and west, forming a perfect cross with the sealed section at the center. "The joint ritual requires both primary bloodlines," Daniel explained, rolling up his sleeve. "But it also benefits from the presence of witnesses, those who understand the binding but aren't directly connected to it. That's why Robert and Elaine are here." "Are they Holloways too?" I asked. Daniel shook his head. "Not by blood. They're part of a small group that has assisted our family over the generations. People who have encountered the waiting ones in other contexts and recognize the importance of maintaining the bindings." Elaine handed Daniel a leather pouch similar to the one that had contained my ritual materials. From it, he withdrew a silver knife with an ornately carved handle, a small vial of dark powder, and a folded paper. "The ritual itself isn't complicated," he said, unfolding the paper to reveal a diagram of interconnected symbols. "But the timing must be precise and the intent must be unified. We'll each draw blood and combine it with the binding agents, then apply the mixture to specific points on the concrete seal while reciting the words of containment." I eyed the knife warily. How much blood are we talking about? Just enough to create the mixture. A few drops each, no more than what you've already been using for the monthly renewal. That seemed reasonable enough, though I still felt a lingering distrust. These people had broken into my home after all, and until tonight, I'd had no idea the Holloway family remained connected to the house. But the information in the codex supported their claims, and their knowledge of the waiting ones and the binding rituals was too detailed to be fabricated. All right, I agreed. Show me what to do. Daniel instructed me to kneel at my position while he knelt at his. Elaine placed the stone bowl in the center of the concrete seal and added the various powders and herbs, creating a mixture similar to what I'd used for the monthly renewal but with several additional components. When I give the signal, Daniel said, we'll each cut our palms and hold them over the bowl, allowing exactly 7 drops of blood to fall. Then we'll recite the binding words together while Elaine completes the mixture. I nodded, taking the silver knife when he passed it to me. The handle felt warm against my skin, the symbols carved into it seeming to shift subtly when not viewed directly. Now, Daniel said softly, drawing the knife across his palm in one swift motion. I did the same, wincing at the sharp sting as my blood welled up. Together we held our bleeding hands over the bowl, counting the drops silently. 1, 3. The powder in the bowl hissed faintly as our blood made contact, releasing a subtle aroma like petrichor, the smell of rain on dry earth. After the 7th drop, Daniel began to speak words I recognized from the codex but had never pronounced aloud. I joined in, our voices creating an unusual harmony, his deeper tones and my higher ones weaving together. As we spoke, Elaine stirred the mixture with a bone implement, moving in precise patterns. The air in the basement grew heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The temperature dropped noticeably, our breath becoming visible in the suddenly chilled air. From the walls around us came that now familiar sensation of watching, of attention focused intently on our actions. As we completed the recitation, the mixture in the bowl began to glow with a faint bluish light. Elaine dipped her finger into it and began tracing symbols on the concrete seal, complex interlocking patterns that corresponded to the diagram on Daniel's paper. When she completed the final symbol, a shockwave seemed to emanate from the center of the seal, rippling outward through the house. The concrete beneath the symbols cracked audibly, though the cracks sealed themselves almost immediately, leaving no visible damage. The basement lights flickered, went out for several seconds, then returned. And from within or beneath the sealed area came a sound, neither scratching nor whispering but a deep, resonant tone, like a massive bell struck once and allowed to fade slowly. I felt the vibration of it in my chest, in my bones, in the very structure of my consciousness. "We are bound," came the Waiting One's collective voice, clearer than I'd ever heard it before. "The agreement stands. Alice and Holloway together, as it was set, as it must remain." The presence withdrew, the heaviness in the air dissipating. The temperature gradually returned to normal, and the glowing symbols on the concrete faded back to ordinary marking. Daniel sat back on his heels, exhaling slowly. "It's done. The binding is restored to full strength." Elaine handed each of us a clean cloth to wrap around our cut palms. As I pressed the fabric against my wound, I noticed something odd. The edges of the cut were already closing, healing at an accelerated rate. "Side effect of the ritual," Daniel explained when he saw my surprised expression. "The blood given freely for the binding carries certain benefits in return. Enhanced healing is one of them." I examined my palm more closely. By the time I unwrapped it completely, only a thin pink line remained where the cut had been, a healing process that should have taken days compressed into minutes. "What other benefits are there?" I asked, suspicion returning. This aspect of the arrangement hadn't been mentioned in the codex sections I'd read. "Nothing dramatic," Daniel assured me. "Slightly quicker healing, increased resistance to illness, occasionally enhanced intuition. The Waiting Ones have a vested interest in keeping their binders healthy and functional. It's a practical arrangement more than a reward." Robert and Elaine were already packing away their ritual implements. The atmosphere had shifted from tense confrontation to something approaching cautious cooperation. "We should talk," I said to Daniel as we climbed the stairs back to the main floor. "I have questions that the Codex doesn't answer, and it seems you have information I need." "Agreed," he replied. "And I suspect you've discovered things about the Waiting Ones that we should know as well. Our families have maintained separate but complementary records over the generations. Sharing that knowledge can only strengthen the binding." In the kitchen, A strange domesticity ensued as Elaine made coffee while Robert stood awkwardly by the back door, clearly unsure of his welcome now that the ritual was complete. I invited them all to sit at the kitchen table, deciding that if I was going to trust them enough to perform an ancient blood ritual, I might as well offer them coffee. As we sat together in the pre-dawn hours, Daniel explained more about the history between our families. Edward Holloway had indeed built the house and established the initial binding, but financial difficulties had forced him to sell the property in 1938. William Ellis had purchased it with full knowledge of what existed beneath the land, knowledge that Edward had been ethically bound to disclose. Rather than simply transferring responsibility, the two men had created a new arrangement, a shared guardianship that leveraged both bloodlines' connection to the binding. The Ellis family would maintain the day-to-day containment through the monthly rituals, while the Holloway family would return quarterly to reinforce the deeper structural aspects of the binding. The arrangement worked well for decades, Daniel said, wrapping his hands around his coffee mug. Even when family members were reluctant at first, they eventually understood the importance of what we were doing. But in recent years, as our generations grew more distant from the original pact makers, maintaining continuity became challenging. That's why we formed the Watchers, Elaine added. People like Robert and me who have encountered the Waiting Ones or similar entities in other contexts, who understand what's at stake if the bindings fail. Are there others like the Waiting Ones? I asked, a chill running through me at the thought. In other locations? Daniel nodded grimly. Junction points exist throughout the world, places where the barriers between realities are naturally thin. Most have some form of containment, whether created deliberately like our binding or formed organically through centuries of human ritual and belief. Some are weaker than others. Robert spoke up for the first time, his voice surprisingly soft for such a large man. I encountered an unbound junction point in northern Minnesota 20 years ago. 3 people died before we managed to establish even a basic containment. I thought of the vision the Waiting Ones had shared with me, the celestial alignment they awaited, the transformation they anticipated. Do you know what they're waiting for? What happens when they finish waiting? The 3 exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. There are theories, Daniel said carefully. The records from both our families suggest the Waiting Ones perceive time and reality differently than we do. They experience multiple timelines simultaneously, existing in a state that's neither fully in our world nor completely separate from it. The junction points are like anchors, Elaine continued. Places where they can maintain a stable connection to our reality while mostly existing in their own. The binding doesn't trap them here so much as it regulates how and when they can interact with our world. But what are they waiting for? I pressed. Daniel sighed, running a hand through his close-cropped hair. According to the oldest records, they're waiting for a cosmic alignment that occurs approximately every 10,000 years, a configuration of stars and planets that temporarily widens all junction points simultaneously. When that happens, the Waiting Ones believe they can fully transition from their reality to ours, or perhaps to another reality entirely. And what happens to our world if they succeed? That, said Daniel solemnly, is what the binding is designed to prevent us from discovering. The implications were staggering. Our families hadn't merely been containing troublesome supernatural entities, we'd been preventing a potential reshaping of reality itself. The monthly rituals, the quarterly joint binding, all of it was aimed at maintaining a cosmic barrier that had existed for thousands of years before the house was built, before European settlement, perhaps before human civilization. As dawn's first light began to filter through the kitchen windows, we reached an agreement. Daniel and his Watchers would share their records with me, adding their knowledge to what I'd already learned from the Codex. In return, I would continue the Ellis side of the binding and work with them on the quarterly ritual. Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, Daniel said as they prepared to leave. She took her responsibility seriously but was never overcome by it. She managed to live a full life while honoring the pact. I hope you can find a similar balance. I wasn't sure such a balance was possible for me, but I appreciated the sentiment. As we stood on the back porch watching the sunrise, I felt a strange kinship with these people who had been strangers and intruders just hours before. We were united by knowledge few others possessed, by a responsibility few others could understand. After they left, I returned to the library and opened my journal, recording everything I'd learned from Daniel and his companions. As I wrote, I felt the Waiting One's attention, not threatening but aware, observant. They were part of the house now, or perhaps more accurately, the house was part of them, a permeable boundary between their reality and mine. I had inherited more than property and furnishings when my grandmother left me this house. I had inherited a cosmic responsibility, a bloodline obligation that stretched back generations and would likely extend forward beyond my lifetime. The question now was how to honor that inheritance while still creating a life for myself. How to be a guardian without becoming a prisoner of my own legacy. The answer to that question would come in time, I supposed. For now, I had a house to maintain, binding rituals to perfect, and a new alliance to navigate. The waiting ones would continue their patient vigil within the walls, and I would continue learning how to coexist with them. Outside, the morning light strengthened, dispelling the shadows of night. But I knew better now. Darkness wasn't something that arrived with sunset and departed with dawn. It was always there in the spaces between watching and waiting. And so was I. That was 3 months ago. I've since completed another monthly renewal and participated in one more joint ritual with Daniel and the Watchers. The house remains quiet, the waiting ones honoring their part of the arrangement. I've continued my twilight communications with them, learning more about their perception of reality, their long history with this land. They've shown me visions of civilizations that existed here thousands of years before European settlement, peoples who recognized the junction point and created their own methods of containment, stone circles, ritual dances, oral traditions that maintain the boundaries between worlds. Sometimes, especially during storms or on particularly dark nights, I still hear the scratching in the walls, still feel the weight of ancient eyes watching me from spaces I can't access. But the fear has largely been replaced by fascination, by a growing understanding of my place in a much larger pattern. I've decided to stay in the house permanently, to fully embrace my inheritance and the responsibility that comes with it. The remote job has become a career I can maintain from here, and I've begun renovating some of the rooms to better suit my needs. The house is becoming mine in a way it wasn't before, not just a temporary residence but a home, albeit one with unusual occupants. Daniel visits regularly now, no longer breaking in but coming openly to share knowledge and help maintain the binding. The Watchers have introduced me to others who understand the hidden world that exists alongside our ordinary reality, people who have encountered different manifestations of the in-between spaces and found their own ways of navigating them. I've learned that the world is far stranger than most people realize, that the solid reality we perceive is merely the most visible layer of something far more complex and mutable. The barriers between worlds are thinner in some places than others, and those of us who become aware of this truth have choices to make about how we respond to it. My choice was to become a guardian, to accept the inheritance passed down through my bloodline and to honor the pact made by my great-grandfather. It's not always an easy path. There are nights when the whispers grow loud, when the walls seem to pulse with otherworldly presence, when I wonder if I've made a terrible mistake. But there are also moments of profound connection, of understanding that transcends ordinary human experience. The waiting ones have existed for millennia, perceiving realities I can barely comprehend. And yet, through our strange symbiosis, I've glimpsed aspects of existence few humans ever encounter. So I remain in my grandmother's house, my house now, walking the boundary between worlds. The binding holds, renewed by blood freely given and ritual precisely performed. The waiting ones continue their patient vigil and I continue mine. If you ever inherit an old house with oddly spaced walls, if you ever hear scratching sounds that seem to follow your movements, if you ever glimpse symbols that appear and disappear depending on the light, pay attention. You might be living on a junction point, might be sharing your space with entities that exist just beyond the edge of normal perception. Not all of them are like the waiting ones. Not all of them honor agreements or respect boundaries. Some junctions have no guardians, no binding rituals, nothing to regulate the interaction between realities. What would you have done if you were in my place? Would you have fled after the first encounter with the things in the walls? Or would you have stayed, seeking understanding rather than escape? Have you ever experienced something you can't explain while alone in your home? Cold spots that shouldn't exist, sounds with no logical source, a sense of being watched when no one else is present? Perhaps you've already encountered a junction point without recognizing it for what it was. If you enjoyed this true home alone horror story, please subscribe to The Creepy Shadow for more glimpses into the spaces between worlds. Like and share this video for more terrifying true life stories that will send shivers down your spine. Leave a comment sharing your own unexplainable encounters. Because sometimes, acknowledging the strangeness of reality is the first step toward understanding it. Until next time, remember, not all empty houses are truly empty. And the walls have been watching for far longer than any of us have been alive.